As I said, our aim tonight is to inform you, and then after the presentation, for you to inform us. All right. Dealing with sort of the first couple of chapters of the report. So we've met 10 times. We'll meet another couple before our work is done as a panel together. We started off by going to see a frack and a drill in Moomba in South Australia, because we wanted to see what that looked like. We wanted to see what all the trucks on a pad looked like. We wanted to see what the land disturbance looked like, the camps, the demountables, and so on. Now, in South Australia, they hydraulically fracture what's called sandstone or tight gas. They don't drill horizontally, so they don't bend the drill bit and go down sideways, but they do drill straight down at considerable depth, and the fracking process is all but identical in terms of the pressure, the chemicals used, and so on. So although it's tight gas, and sometimes that's called conventional gas, and that's what occurs down in Mereenie, nevertheless, the hydraulic fracturing process is relevantly similar. Of course, we couldn't see a shale drill and frack in the Northern Territory because, as you well know, there's a moratorium. We released a background and issues paper in February of last year. It seems like a long time ago now. And that was our attempt at identifying, again, pursuant to community feedback, who gave us additional risks and threats. It was our attempt at identifying, based on scientific research, based on what the community told us, all of the risks associated with this particular industry. That then has formed really the template of the work that we have carried out over the last year. That is, those are the risks that we have gone away and researched and analyzed and reported back on. And those are the risks that we've looked at to see whether or not they can be mitigated, and then pursuant to that mitigation, what is the overall risk assessment associated with each particular risk. Again, because enough people told us that we should do so during the community meetings, went to Queensland and visited, because we wanted to see what the CSG operations looked like in Queensland. Now, as you hopefully by now know, there are significant differences with CSG gas, but there are enough relevant similarities to make that trip very productive. We spoke to people who had had some very bad adverse interactions with the gas company. They'd had a terrible time. They'd suffered health effects. They had suffered sort of mental stress and anxiety, physical symptoms. And they had a generally, I think, a very unpleasant time dealing with some of the gas companies who just marched onto their land without adequate consultation and negotiation and so on. We also spoke to some farmers who had had beneficial experiences. I suspect, in fact, I know a little bit, perhaps later down the track, when some lessons had been learnt, who'd had a good positive experience with gas companies. Certainly in one instance, we visited a farm where the farmer was allowed to double crop because of the produced water that came out that was processed and sold at a very reduced rate, allowed extra productivity on that land. We consulted with regulators who frankly admitted that many mistakes had been made in Queensland. You had 3 large projects that had come online all at the same time. The regulatory framework wasn't properly robust enough. There hadn't been adequate social planning, and many unhappy people were the result, and they've, in a sense, almost been playing catch up ever since. And we certainly spoke to people, in and around Rama and Chinchilla areas, mayors, former mayors, and so on. We went to a gas field operated by Santos, which is a reasonably mature gas field. It had older wells, newer wells. It had cattle being grazed on it, and it had a significant amount of rehabilitation. But again, we wanted to see what that looked like from the road and walking across the land, what that impact looked like. We also consulted with pastoralists and went to go and visit pastoral stations, large and small, in the Northern Territory, in the Beetaloo sub-basin area, and particularly down near Amungi, to see again what the clearing looked like for the Amungi Origin drilled well, and to speak to the people who had had to negotiate through that process and how that had impacted them, to better understand the working operations of a cattle station, and again, what impact this industry might have on them. And that has very much informed some of the recommendations that you see in Chapter 14. We released the interim report, which was really our attempt at sort of flagging to everybody, to the world at large, the direction in which we're heading in, and we did further consultations after that. We released the Assel-Allen Economics Consultancy Report, and just in January, we released the 3 principal reports and a summary report, 4 reports of coffee. We also visited the Mereenie gas fields, again, because we wanted to see what a considerably more mature gas field looked like, again, in terms of rehabilitation and the impact on the vegetation, to talk about how Central Petroleum, how they interacted with the local community, what training programs they had, number of Aboriginal persons employed there, and so on. As I said, Mereenie is it's styled a conventional gas field, but it's a sandstone gas field, tight gas, but a third of those wells have been fracked. Again, we wanted to see what that impact looked like. And to ask people who lived in the Alice region, again, what they thought about that. And then, of course, we have released the draft report in December. We're having the final round of consultations, and we will, of course, consider the views expressed by the community, the further submissions that we've received. We've had a final round of public hearings. We will revise the report. It's a draft report, as it says on the cover. It will be subject to change. And then we will report to the government in March. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Jones, who's going to talk to us about basically the risk assessment methodology. How was it that we arrived at the risk assessments that we did, both pre and post mitigation? And then he's going to talk to us about well design and construction and well integrity. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Pepper, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Rachel said, this is a key part of the process which has occupied a lot of time of the panel. This is the engine, essentially, which drove the transformation of our identified risks into the key recommendations that we have made and the conclusions we've reached that, provided the mitigation is put in place, the levels of risk will be acceptable. So it's really important that this process is explained very clearly. This started early last year with the first community consultation meeting, in which the panel met with numerous people right throughout the NT to discuss and identify the number of risks which should be considered that this industry could cause an impact on the environment, on land, air, water, society, and cultural type impacts and greenhouse gas emission impacts. Out of that process, we identified about 115 different risks under those various categories, and each of those has been worked through by the process I'm going to describe to work out what the risk is and how it might be mitigated to what's called an acceptable level. The process we followed is what's called a qualitative risk assessment. The evidence we used to carry out this risk assessment is derived from a whole variety of sources, including all of the plethora of national and international panel reports which have been carried out into this industry in many jurisdictions, hundreds of published papers in the open literature, and also the many hundreds of submissions that we have received from the community, from industry, and from government about this particular issue. So starting with this process, first up, we had to identify how likely is something to occur. And the metrics that we used so that you understand what low, medium, and high mean here, low was less than 1%, in other words, less than 1 in 100 chance of occurring. Medium was between 1% and 10%, less than 100 to 1 in 10, and high was greater than a 1 in 10 chance of occurring. We used the published literature, and particularly all of the studies that have been done in the US, which has a very big shale gas industry, as I'm sure you're aware, to assign that kind of likelihood. And I'll explain a little bit later on with a worked example as to how that's applied. The consequence, of course, refers to the magnitude of the impact. So low, medium or high. And once again, for example, in the case of water, what low means is a very small spill contained to the working area, doesn't escape, doesn't contaminate anything. It can just be cleaned up in a very short time. Medium is a bit bigger amount, so the consequences are a little bit bigger. It might require contaminated soil to be cleaned up, water to be treated and so on, but once again, it hasn't escaped to cause damage to key environmental receptors. High, that is a big one. That means that the contamination has escaped the area of containment, it's contaminated the groundwater, or it's contaminated the surface water area around, and those areas require remediation. So that gives you an idea of the scale of consequence, for water anyway. And for each of the theme areas that we worked on, for the land, air, water, social and so on, a consequence rating was developed by each of the authors of those chapters. And if you read the report, you'll see what the likelihood and exposure and consequence of hazard were assigned for each of the chapters. When you combine the consequence and the likelihood, you end up with a net risk. So just to give you an example of how a qualitative risk assessment works, if something is low and low, the product is low. So that means it's a low risk. If it is low and high, it comes out medium. And if it's high and high, of course, it comes out high. Now, in the process of the risk assessment we carried out, anything that was medium or high was unacceptable straight off. And so that required an additional level of mitigation. And by mitigation, we mean some kind of design or engineering strategy which can be carried out to stop that risk from being medium or high. In other words, to reduce it to low. And if that's applied, that mitigation is applied, then what we end up with is a residual risk. And that residual risk has to be low. Otherwise, in the first instance, it's not acceptable. So just to give you a worked example of how this might be applied, for example, consider a spill on the surface of the land around a working area or a drill pad. The evidence from the United States told us that this is going to occur. No question, it's medium to high. It will happen. So having said that, what is the consequence? Well, once again, the consequence of a spill occurring is very much dependent on the amount that's spilled. If it's a little bit of a spill, it can be cleaned up easily, so the consequence is low. The problem is here, though, we don't know in advance how big this might be. So what we had to do was apply what's called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle basically says that if you know there's going to be an event, but you don't know how big the consequence might be, but you're sure there's going to be an event, you assume the worst and apply the highest level of mitigation, even though subsequently it might be found that that mitigation mightn't be required. So basically, be prepared for the worst, put that mitigation in, and it should be good. So in the case of a surface spill, for example, as I said, the consequence could range from small to large. But irrespective of that, we have to assume that it's going to be large. So how do you mitigate that? Well, the only real way of mitigating that is what's called source control. So if a spill occurs, basically, you don't want that spill either moving off-site or down into the groundwater. And the only way you can mitigate that is to have engineering controls. So in the case of moving off to surface water, that area has to have a bund around it. It has to be contained, so that anything that's spilt can be contained. In the case of getting to groundwater, we've recommended that the working area be covered with an impermeable layer like a compacted clay or a geomembrane. So if a spill occurs, basically you've got a barrier there. It actually can't go down, because if it does go down, irrespective of the size of the spill, it has to be cleaned up. And the bigger the spill, the more cleanup has to occur. So we think it's prudent insurance practice to stop that from occurring. And finally, what's acceptable? That's a very good and a key question. Since I'm a water person, I'll give you an answer to that from the point of view of a water quality perspective. Most people are concerned about the quality of their water, whether it be drinking water or stock water. The position we've taken is that that water resource will not be compromised from its highest beneficial use. In other words, if it's a drinking water aquifer, there should be no contamination which will stop that from being used from drinking water. And I think most people would accept that. In other words, that is an acceptable risk, that it's not contaminated to degrade it. How do we measure that? As scientists, we like to measure things. Well, the way we measure it is to apply the Australian Drinking Water Quality Guidelines. So you analyse the water regularly, periodically, and say, okay, what are all these things telling us? Has there been any variance from what's considered acceptable drinking water quality? If there is, it's been contaminated. If there isn't, it hasn't been. So that's our quantitative scientific objective. The highest level objective is no compromise to the highest beneficial use of the water. So moving on to the next chapter of the report, this is essentially a chapter which gives the whole operational description of the shale gas industry, from woe to go, from exploration through to drilling of wells, through hydraulic fracturing and so on. And also talks about water quality, issues involved with water quality management, waste management, and also aspects of seismic activity. One of the key things in this whole industry, of course, is the well life cycle. These wells must be constructed to the highest possible standards so that they don't cause any compromise to the environmental values that we've identified and don't cause degradation of resources so that they're no longer acceptable for future beneficial use. Well life cycle proceeds in a number of stages. The design phase, and this is really critical. This is where all of the elements that have been found in exploration, which relate to the geology, to the nature of the water, to the nature of the rocks, and so on, are integrated and specified that you must use a certain quality of steel, you must use a certain quality of cement, you must use a certain drilling practice to ensure that that well is completed safely and in an environmentally sound way. And basically, currently, companies have to submit their well design to the regulator for a rigorous assessment and say, this design is consistent with meeting your objectives. If the well design is not approved or it's found to be deficient, then the next phase doesn't start or can't start. Construction phase involves drilling large vertical holes down to about 2 to 3 kilometres, or 4 kilometres in some cases, and then subsequently laterally into the resource, which is located at about 4 kilometres depth. It's important to note that the way this operation proceeds, most protection is afforded to that surface layer where the critical groundwater aquifers are located. And that's where multiple barriers are put in, up to 5 or 6 in most cases of surface and deeper casings. And that comprises layers of steel, highly engineered steel casing, cement, steel, etc., etc. So at the top here, laterally, there's up to 5 barriers to stop any lateral migration occurring. As you move down the hole, there are progressively less casing strings, reflecting the fact that those areas down there don't require as much lateral protection. In terms of well integrity, it's this vertical section which is critical, because that vertical section stops the transmission from the production zone down here up to the top. So when we're talking about well integrity, it is that vertical section that we're talking about. This horizontal or production section is only of relevance to production in the target formation. It is actually designed to be perforated and hydraulically fractured. So an issue with the, if you like, the casing string down here might be an operational or economic issue, but it's not an environmental issue. So hydraulic fracturing, what happens there? Well, a mixture of various chemicals, sand and water, are injected down at very high pressure, up to 11,000 psi. That fractures the rock and creates the fractures that enable gas to subsequently flow. Then, once that's done, that can take, well, the drilling and hydraulic fracturing can take several months. After that, the well comes into production. And that's quite a long period. It can be from 2 to 3 or even 4 decades. So that is a very long phase for the life of a well. And once again, managing the well through that period is really very critical. Finally, decommissioning and abandonment. Once the well's reached the end of its productive life, it has to be sealed off. And this involves vertical sealing with typically plugs of cement that are 20, 30, or even in some cases 50 metres long. We're not talking about a standard concrete slab, which is about that thick. We're actually talking about 20 or 30 metres, which is a very long interval. And then the surface facilities are removed, the well's cut off, and the system is monitored for a period thereafter to make sure there are no leaks of particular gas. We're not so much concerned about fluid leaks, but gas can be a potential issue. Wastewater is a thing which is in everyone's mind, of course. The water that's used in the process, the water that's produced. So how much water is used in this process? Well, about 2 megalitres for drilling and 2 megalitres for each hydraulic fracturing stage. And when you consider that there can be 20 to 30 hydraulic fracturing stages, you can easily have 50 to 60 megalitres of water that are required for this process for each well. What does that mean? Well, an Olympic-sized swimming pool contains about 2.5 megalitres. So what we're talking about is 20 to 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water per well to frack its multiple stages. So it is a significant consumer of water. So what happens when that water is injected down? Well, it goes down into the formation. Its initial function with the sand and other things is to essentially blast open the rock into very small fissures under pressure. That pressure is released, and then what happens is that the rock relaxes back a bit and some of that water is forced back up to the surface. That's called flowback water. And the amount of water that actually does flow back depends on the formation, but based on the data we've got from the Amunji well, about 1/3 to 1/5 of that water comes back to the surface in that first instance. So that's called flowback water. But thereafter, as you can see from this diagram, the flowback water occurs initially rapidly and then subsequently falls off with a very long tail. That's called produced water or formation water, and that's very salty water, and that continues to come up through the well life and does need to be managed. So what we're talking about is a high volume of water that needs to be managed initially and a decreasing and lower volume of water that needs to be managed throughout the well life. And typically what happens is that water comes up with some of the gas. It goes into a gas-water separator. The gas goes off to be compressed and transmitted, and the water is retained in a tank or other facility. And then it has to be removed for other processing or treatment. Of course, people are very concerned about what's in this water. In terms of the fracking fluid, that's a known recipe. We know now what chemicals are used, about 35 chemicals that are typically used in a typical hydraulic fracturing operation. The recipe is there, they're known chemicals. So that's a known. What's unknown, however, generally, is what comes back up the hole from when the hydraulic fracturing is done, because that water interacts with the shale gas formation. It dissolves up minerals, it dissolves up organic materials, and that comes up to the surface. So if we're going to really appropriately or properly assess the likely health consequences or environmental impacts from this type of water, we need to know what's in that produced water as well. So our key recommendations are that there's full disclosure, full public disclosure of what's used for fracking, so how much of each chemical, what chemicals are used, and then what the concentration is in the produced water as well. So then everyone, including us scientists, can be fully informed of what's in that water and what its risk profile might be. And it's until you have that information, you really can't carry out an adequate risk assessment, particularly human health risk assessment, of what the consequences of that water might be. Well integrity is a very hot topic in this industry. It essentially refers to the ability of the well system to maintain isolation from the environment of all of the chemicals and other things that are used in the extraction and production of gas. As I've illustrated earlier, and this is an expanded version of the near surface of a well control system. And as you can see here at the surface, this is the groundwater resource to be protected. That's where most barriers are. When we talk about well failure, we're not necessarily talking about loss of well integrity. A single one of those barriers can fail for a variety of reasons, whether it be the cement or the steel, but that does not mean that things can get out and flow into the groundwater. All barriers have to fail, and that's a really important distinction to make, because often in quite a few published papers, this issue of failure is talked about. And that's typically single barrier failure, not failure of well integrity. It's only failure of well integrity which will result in a significant environmental impact. As I said, this is a really important topic, one which the panel has taken very seriously. We did our own review of the material which is available, but in the end we decided we really needed to get in an additional expert review, so we commissioned CSIRO to carry out a detailed international review. CSIRO has a lot of expertise in all of the engineering aspects that are involved in gas production, in drilling, in fracking, in cement and all those other sorts of things, as well as they've been doing a lot of very advanced modelling on what the consequences might be of barrier failure. In other words, if you get a crack in the cement or a crack in the outer sheathing, what might that mean for how much gas or how much water might come up? And so that particular modelling has seriously informed the conclusions they reached as well. So what they found was that with a review of appropriate literature and comparing like with like, and I emphasise comparing like with like, they found that total well failure, in other words, loss of integrity and potential for environmental consequence, were only about 0.1%, which is about 1 in 1,000, which is very much on the low end of our risk scale. In comparison, single barrier failure is indeed much higher. It's 1 to 10%, which is actually medium. But the consequences of that single barrier failure are not a high level of environmental impact or high on our scale. So single barrier failure really needs to be distinguished from complete failure of well integrity. And as I said, it's that vertical section of the well bore, that 2 to 4 kilometre length, which is what we talk about when we talk about the need to maintain well integrity. It's not the horizontal section, which is the production zone. And so that last dot point there, single barrier failures do not result in release of gas or fluid to the environment. It's a really important one. So recommendations, well, I'd say build it well, build it to last. Build well from the start. That's what all of the evidence is telling us. If these well systems are built to a high standard from the start, the highest possible standard, highest quality control, they will last. That's what the evidence is telling us. They will last through the operational life. I'm not specifically talking about abandonment here, I'm talking about operational life. We also recommended that all wells be category 9 or above. That's a very specific recommendation and one I think which industry has queried us about. The reason we are saying that is because the observational evidence is telling us that wells that have been constructed to that category in the United States have not failed with either single barrier failures or failures of well integrity. So that's why we're mandating such a relatively high standard of materials and construction. The other thing that's really important is that a cradle-to-grave management system. Once these wells are constructed, they need to be regularly monitored, their integrity needs to be checked, and in the event of any issues with single barrier failures or other things, those need to be publicly reported and fixed as soon as possible, and the results of that fixing actually reported as well. There's nothing like public reporting to sharpen the knife, as it were, in terms of ensuring that compliance is carried out. And that there should also be an enforceable code of practice for abandonment of wells. In other words, what's going to happen in the centuries after a well is abandoned. There's quite a lot of work that's been done on that. In fact, in the CSIRO report, there's quite an extensive section on what we know about potential longevity of particularly cements. And one of the areas that's informed that is the injection of carbon dioxide into deep wells. In other words, carbon sequestration from fossil fuel production, so-called clean coal technology. And basically, they've done a lot of work on subjecting these cements to high-pressure carbon dioxide, which is a really aggressive and corrosive environment. And there's some quite insightful findings that have been obtained from that. And one of them is that, okay, this medium might react with the cement and might change it, but it doesn't necessarily cause it to crack or crumble. In fact, it can form secondary minerals which are just as impermeable as the original cement was. So this is an important thing to bear in mind. The cements that are used in this industry are not the equivalent of your masonry brick cements or mortars or something like that. And all of you know, and probably have examples like I do in my home, where this cement is exfoliating, particularly if it comes into contact with salty water. These cements are designed to cope with those kinds of chemical environments. They're not your typical building cements. So I'll leave it there.
Good morning, everybody. And we've got 3 water scientists here, but unfortunately not all the panel could be here, so we don't have a geologist. Excuse me. So I'll do my best to try and explain what we do know about the industry. and how it might develop, as Justice Pepper just explained. So where is there shale gas in Northern Territory? This map we've used in most of our publications is those blobs are where shale is known to be. But most of those shale areas are really very poorly defined and unexplored. There's been 1 or 2 wells drilled into them, really for a bit of geological exploration. There's only been one successfully fracked well, and that was the Amungi well in the Beetaloo Basin. But despite that lack of information, what we do know is that the Beetaloo Basin holds about 70% of the assumed potential possible shale resources. It's very early stage of exploration for this industry, and those resources just aren't well defined yet. But of what is known, it seems to be that area. So the Beetaloo Basin is this bit here in basically the middle. There has been, though, as Justice Pepper pointed out earlier, some hydraulic fracturing of tight gas wells in the Mereenie area, and about 1/3 of the wells there have been hydraulically fracked. And as she said, there's really no difference in the nature of the fluids that are used, the nature of the equipment used to pump the high pressure down there to fracture the rock. The difference is really the rock is sandstone, not shale, and the wells have been drilled vertically, not vertically and then horizontally. So what might development look like if the moratorium was lifted, and how long, over what sort of time frame might something happen? With a reasonably optimistic scenario of good success for exploration, if the moratorium was lifted, you might be able to get 1 or 2 resources developed in the next 5 to 10 years. And because of the knowledge that we have at the moment, the Beetaloo sub-basin is where most of the potential resources seem to be. That's likely to be the first one to be developed, if there is that sort of development. So quite early on in the inquiry, the companies who have exploration permits there, so the large blue area, dark blue area is Pangaea, and the light blue area is Origin, and the green is Santos. Over the course of this inquiry, the outline of the Beetaloo sub-basin has changed somewhat. It used to look like a sort of malformed duck. It retains a little bit of that, but it's been broken into now 2 areas in this red dashed outline. And that's really slightly better definition of where the Valkyrie shales are underneath that area. So there are 3 companies that have exploration permits in that area. They have, quite early on, indicated to us what they think a development scenario might look like for their exploration permit on the basis of the information that they have to the point when the moratorium was put in place. And they've estimated that among the 3, there is likely to be something like 1,000 to 1,200 wells, and that they would be on around 150 to 200 drilling pads. So this is an industry where there are multiple wells on the one pad. They go deep down to the shale layer and then laterally out from those pads to tap into the resource. So you have far fewer pads on the surface than you have number of wells that are going down. So what we've tried to do here is draw to scale what the industry or those companies have said that their development scenario might be, and we've drawn that to scale in terms of the number of pads on the surface, so that you can get a sense of that scale across the landscape. So, so this is the Beetaloo sub-basin. That's Daly Waters there, Elliott there. We've got Mataranka and Nooka, just to give you some scale of where we're at. And then to scale, that little patch of dots there is where Pangaea's development might be, or the scale of Pangaea's development. That would be what Origin has indicated might be production for them, and that's what Santos have indicated might be production for them. So it's very important to understand a couple of things from that, that If this industry might go ahead, there's quite some time for development of the industry. It's not something that can be done in a hurry. You cannot rush a 3 kilometre deep well. It takes a while to develop it and frack it. And also, it's not drilling pads right across the whole Beetaloo sub-basin. It's a relatively small patches of that would be likely to develop at least in the first instance. And so that's over that sort of 5 to 10 year basis with longer duration running of those operations. So bear that in mind when we get to the subsequent chapters, because it's very important when we're thinking about landscape impacts that we've got that sense of scale in mind. So thank you for that, and I'll hand over.
Good morning all. Yes, water. This is probably the most mentioned issue through all of our consultations. It's obviously very, very high on everyone's mind. We focused on three compartments or three consequences of adequately protecting water: protecting the amount of water, protecting the quality of it regarding contamination, and also insurance. So they're very much to do with humans. The other one was protecting aquatic ecosystems. So we assessed 20 water-related risks, made 19 recommendations, which are in the summary and in the main report. And out of that, really, there are a number of issues which you can have a look at, but I'm going to focus on the four high-priority issues as far as our assessment is concerned. One was the potential for too much water to be taken out by the industry. That's unsustainable groundwater. I'll focus mostly on groundwater and explain that in just a moment. Contamination from two sources, and earlier speakers have talked about that, the possibility of leaky wells and the possibility of surface spills getting through to the aquifers. And also in terms of the ecosystems, depending on where you are, and we'll focus mainly on that Beetaloo Basin, but the potential for effects on groundwater and surface water, but particularly in this case, groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So talking about water supply, the industry does use a lot. Dr. Jones said about 2 megalitres for drilling and 1 to 2 megalitres for every time they frack a region. And they can do 10, 20, 30 fracks. So the sort of amounts that you're talking about per well is of the order of 40 or 50 megalitres. Scale that up to the sort of industry, the type of industry that Dr. Smith talked about, you're seeing that of the order of 2,500 to 5,000 megs a year being used. That's a lot of water. It's about the same amount, the 5,000. The pastoral industry in the Beetaloo Basin uses around about 6,000. So that's sort of idea. We, in terms of the knowledge base of the groundwater resource, particularly in the Beetaloo Basin, there's quite a bit known about the top part of Beetaloo, around Daly Waters. That's been reasonably well studied, but the further south is very poorly known, and we were reluctant to make a call on the risk if an industry was developed there. The industry is suggesting that at least first stage that they'll be higher up, they'll be around Daly Waters. As Dr. Smith pointed out, the three major players at the moment. But I'll come back and talk about the need for additional information. We were not prepared to make some calls on some of the risks because of a lack of information. And I'll talk about the strategic regional environmental and baseline assessment. But one of the, I suppose, outstanding features, and it's been talked about for quite some time in the NT, is that gas development, petroleum development is controlled under a Resources Act, and they do not need to get a water licence. We don't think that's right, and in fact it does not happen anywhere else in Australia. So irrigators and industries in my state, Victoria, just have to get a licence, or we call them entitlements, and they have to pay for it, and it's quite expensive. And that values the price of water. So we're making recommendations, and it's been made before, that the gas companies, in terms of their water use, become subject to the Water Act. That would require the Water Act to be modified. So they need a licence, and that means that the department have to work out how much water is there and whether in fact it is sustainable to allocate a licence to whoever's applying for it and pay for it. There's also a number of requirements in terms of the overall management within the NT management regime under the Water Act that we think need to be changed to encompass what's going on, or what's likely to go on if the moratorium's lifted in the Beetaloo Basin and subsequently areas. We also think we've made a recommendation that there be no use of surface water resources by the shale gas industry. And the reason for that is, as you well know, the rainfall in the NT is extremely seasonal. Wet season, lots of rain. Well, it depends on where you are, but certainly around the top end here, lots of rain in the wet season, almost nothing during the dry season. It means that you've got water resources, surface water resources there for a short period of time, pretty variable in terms of what the wet season's like. So you can have long wet seasons, short wet seasons, lots of water, not much water. So even the surface water resources that are there would be extremely difficult to work out the management of them from the respect of someone extracting water from them. We just think that that's almost a recipe for some problems, and we think the sensible thing is to recommend that there is no take of surface waters. Can't quite imagine how you would manage that surface water resource that is so uncertain as to whether it's there. And we've also made a restriction, recommended a restriction on the distance between the companies will have to have a bore field, so they might have four bores that is extracting the water going back to the pad to be used. And we're recommending an offset distance, a minimum offset distance of at least 1 kilometre, and we're also recommending, because when they suck the water out, that will reduce the water table, which won't just occur right near the bore, it does extend out, and that could lower a pastoralist bore, or in fact if that was too close to a town, the town bore also. So we're recommending there some offset distances. In terms of the water quality, I'll go through this reasonably quickly, because not that I want to minimise it, but many of the concepts and the recommendations have been covered by previous speakers. So there is no question the potential for wastewater from a shale gas industry to pollute groundwater resources. Two sources, the wastewater and the chemicals, whether they be the fracking chemicals or some of those chemicals that are coming back up from the shale deposit, so the flowback and produced water that Dr. Jones talked about. There's also the potential of methane, not from the point of view of being toxic in the water, but going through that up into the atmosphere. And Dr. Beck will talk about that, because methane is quite a serious greenhouse gas. And we focused on a number of potential contamination pathways, I think about 6 or 7 potential, and assessed the likelihood of those. But the two major ones are the leaky wells, well integrity, and surface spills. So in terms of the leaky wells, I just re-emphasise what Dr. Jones said, and that's the first of the top area here, the potential of leaky wells in the very close to the aquifer. And as he said, the way of ensuring that that is as low as possible is to make sure that the wells are constructed according to a very, very high guidelines, the category 9 or greater. But there is still potential for particularly gas to escape up here, fugitive gas, methane, obviously, because one of the critical possible leak areas is that seal, if you like, between where am I? The cement here and the rock face. So it's been drilled down, been cemented, but that seal, not so much the seal between the cement and the pipe, the pipe, but with the actual rock face itself. That is potential. It's not very likely. Remember, again, you've got something from the frack chemicals down here. You've got about 2 to 3 kilometres there. So yes, there can be cracks there, but whether they extend 2 to 4 kilometres is reasonably unlikely. But nevertheless, we believe that, again, provided the wells are very well constructed, that the likelihood of water, of wastewater getting up to the aquifer is very, very low. It's not the case necessarily, and we'll talk a bit more about this, for gas. Gas is much more, can much more easily penetrate. Even there, though, the likelihood's pretty low. But sure, it can possibly happen. The other one that is there are a number of other ways, but this I'll just talk a little bit about here. So the possibility of the frack chemicals, if there is in fact a fault, then if that fault goes up to the aquifer, that's a possible pathway. Now again, provided if you go back to what Dr. Jones said about making very good planning of where these wells are placed, the companies all need to do seismic surveys. They have to report that to government, and their planning keeps them away from any fault lines. And so that's one, make sure you plan it properly. The second one is the potential for faults to extend for 2 to 3 kilometres up to here is again pretty low. But sure, it can happen if they don't plan properly. So again, just reiterating some of the recommendations we've made. We've made the recommendation that we need more information on those chemicals, particularly the ones that are coming back from the shale deposits. Again, reiterating the high construction standards is an absolute critical, and that there is an independent regulator that Justice Pepper will talk about a little later on, that there is a management plan through the lifetime and subsequently for that well, and that there's ongoing monitoring and public reporting. And you'll see this coming through in many of our recommendations, the idea of monitoring and public reporting of that. Very little of that occurs at the moment. The surface spills, again, just running through this reasonably quickly. We've talked before about the possibility. At the moment, the general situation is that wastewater is stored in ponds, above ground ponds, double lined, double plastic lined, and all the rest of it. So there is, as Dr. Jones said, well, it is likely. There will be spills. I think we can state that no matter what. How big they are, and then subsequently what happens to them is then we need to look at. So there's a couple of things that a spill here getting through to the aquifer. Number one, you've got in Beetaloo anyway, probably 100 to 150 metres here of pretty solid rock, not very porous. That's not the case in some other areas in the NT, but it is there. So we do have, we have got a couple of studies that have been done, they are theoretical studies of what's the potential for penetration through that 100 to 150 metres, and it's very low. However, there's still the possibility that that could occur. So again, in terms of, well, what do you do about it? You try to plan, knowing that there is a potential, there is a likelihood that spills will occur. What do you do to minimise that wastewater can get through here? Well, as you can see there, we've got a number of things. Make certain that the companies have to have an enforceable wastewater and spill management plan. We think also that there, particularly in the NT, that there are some potential issues with the use of open ponds. The industry don't necessarily agree with us, but we think that they should be enclosed tanks, which would again cut down the possibility for overflow and spillage. We also think that, as Dr. Jones said, that another possibility, a management plan, tanks for the wastewater, and aligning clay or fabric over the surface here of the well pad. So those are all attempt, and in addition, the other dot point down there is again the monitoring of what's going on. The other, so that's really what we're recommending, to try to minimise the potential, the likelihood that any spill up here will get through to there. So there are a couple of other recommendations down there again that I'll leave you to read with regard to pipelines and so forth. We'll say a bit about that again. So just a few points about this SREBA, Strategic Regional Environmental Baseline Assessment, which is what we're recommending because there are still unknowns, and we think that there's a need for those unknowns to be plugged as far as possible before things go. So first of all, there are two parts to this that I wanted to emphasise. Just want to emphasise the name because we thought pretty seriously about that. The strategic really says you should really plan this particular assessments very well. The regional means that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the region. In this particular case, the region is the Beetaloo Sub-basin. It's not Origin's exploration permit or Santos, it's the region, because particularly with respect to the groundwater is connected. It's connected from Elliott. It does flow north very, very slowly, but it does flow towards, on one hand, to the Daly, and on the other hand, to the Roper. And that's where those, particularly in that Beetaloo Sub-basin, that's the groundwater-dependent ecosystems that we think are extremely important, Mataranka Springs and the Roper itself. Now, both those systems, the Daly and the Roper, are both, no question, that they're fed by groundwater that, taking many thousands of years, would have started off somewhere around about Daly waters. However, there's a range of information, baseline information, that we think is absolutely essential to have before development occurs. And that's in respect of things like what's the methane concentrations around there at the moment with nothing going on? What's the water quality? Because if we don't have these baseline information, it's going to be impossible to say whether the gas industry, if in fact government allow it, the gas industry has caused it changes. You've got to have baseline. The other part of that, sorry, I got carried away. The other word up there is environmental and baseline. So the baseline, we've got to have it before and after if you're going to attribute what the gas industry has or has not done. The other one, the environmental, is really what we could have used other words, but basically what we're saying is there's some other, not just baseline information, but actually knowledge needs. We don't know, in the case of groundwater, if I use that, we don't know enough, particularly in the southern part of Beetaloo, we don't know enough about how much recharge is occurring each year, probably very little or none. What is the flow rate? Yes, we've got some broad parameters about the flow is north, and the flow is very slow, 1 metre a year or thereabouts, at least in the Beetaloo. But we do need more information there, and we almost certainly, as has been done now in Queensland with the groundwater there, a good regional groundwater model to be able to predict what's occurring. The other point that we've made, which is that second dot point up there, is that SHREBA should be completed and the findings used before approval is given for commercial production. Can be undertaken by exploration. We've been beaten around the head everywhere we've been with groups saying, no, that's not good enough. It's not good enough. You should make the information, the baseline and environmental information, you should get that because of the uncertainties before exploration, drilling and fracking goes ahead. Yeah. So we're working through that at the moment. And the last point there is that the Beetaloo Sub-basin, for all the reasons we've said before, the most prospective area, should be done first.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for staying. So Chapter 8 deals with two particular values of land here in the NT. And these values first relate to biodiversity and ecosystem health. We all know that the NT is a very special place for plants, animals and ecosystems. It's not just a special place for us in the NT, it's a special place internationally. So here in the top end, the ecosystems are part of the world's greatest extent of savannas by a long way. In the arid southern parts of the NT, it's part of one of the world's most biodiverse arid zones. And all through the NT, there are many species of plants and animals that occur nowhere else on Earth. We also know that the NT is a very special place for its landscapes, that we have some of the world's most spectacular and unspoiled landscapes. The panel has determined that the risks of any gas development would only be acceptable if these criteria were met. No impact on terrestrial biodiversity values at the regional scale. Yes, of course, there will be some local impacts, that's unavoidable with any development, but no impact at the broader regional scale. That our healthy ecosystems should be maintained, so the ecological services provided by them will be maintained for future generations. Third, that shale gas infrastructure is never a highly visible part of any landscape. And finally, that heavy vehicle traffic does not significantly impact on the landscape amenity values. And what I'd like to do now is just go through each of those in turn and explain how we've assessed individual risks to these values. So our first determination is that shale gas development should never occur in areas of particularly high conservation value. And we're not just referring to areas like formally declared areas like national parks and conservation reserves that we know have high conservation value, but to other parts of the territory where the information on the distribution of plants and animals is too poorly known now to know if there are other areas of high conservation value. And so our recommendation is that not just national parks and existing conservation reserves should be declared no-go zones, but any other area that has been found on the basis of strategic regional biodiversity assessments as part of SREBA, as Professor Hart has just talked about. If any other areas have been found, based on that information, to have particularly high conservation values, then they should also be no-go zones. The next risk we looked at is the risk of introducing new invasive species or increasing the impact of existing invasive and feral species. And our assessment is that weeds, amongst these, weeds represent by far the greatest risk. And so our attention has focused on preventing that. And we've determined that in order to mitigate the risk of weeds to acceptable levels, then we've got a range of recommendations here. And they include baseline weed assessments before development occurs. That is, we need to have extremely good information where weeds currently are as baseline to understand if there's been any significant spread or introduction of new weeds. We need to have very rigorous weed management plans. And one of our recommendations, which we think is important, is because weeds are such an important issue, and we're talking about large, remote areas that need very high surveillance effort, that there should be dedicated weed officers. The next risk we looked at was the risk of changes to fire regimes, and I'm sure you all know that fire is a very important part of the Northern Territory landscapes, in particular the savannas here in the top end and the central region of the NT. Fire is an integral part of our annual wet-dry cycle. Up here in the top end, about half the country is burnt every single year, and it plays a key role in ecosystem dynamics. Our concerns about changed fire regimes are not just concerns about potential impacts on plants and animals, but also potential impacts on all these savanna burning programs that many of you will be aware of that are occurring now throughout Northern Australia. So these savanna burning programs are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and earning carbon credits. And they're emerging as a very important economic opportunity for remote Northern Australia, and particularly for remote Aboriginal communities. And a large proportion of the high rainfall zone right across Northern Australia, about 30%, is currently under federally recognised savanna burning programs earning carbon credits. And so we don't want to impact on those programs either. And so here are some of our key recommendations for mitigating the risks of changed fire regimes to what we consider to be an acceptable level. Yes, gas companies, of course, have to comply with statutory fire management plans, but we're recommending that gas companies, if development is to proceed, establish a 10-year baseline fire mapping, and this is easily achievable through online information. To have rigorous ignition controls and to have ongoing fire mapping. And if that fire mapping shows that there are significant changes to fire regimes, then there needs to be active management to turn that round. The next risk we looked at is a risk to native vegetation, and this is primarily through land clearing. And so land clearing obviously is inevitable, not just for the well pads, but more so for the roads and pipelines. And the extent of land clearing should development proceed is unclear, because the extent of development is unclear. But just to give some idea, Dr. Smith showed a map of what we would expect over the next, say, 10-year time frame in terms of areas developed, the gas fields in the Beetaloo, as a Beetaloo case study. And together they represented about 5% of the total Beetaloo Basin region, about 5% under development, possibly over the next 10 years. The panel estimates that within a gas field, about 2% of the area is likely to be cleared, about 2%. So we're talking about 2% of 5% of maybe over the next 10-year period if the moratorium were lifted. And to give you some idea of that scale, it's a scale of about 100 square kilometres over the life of the development. And to put that into some perspective, that's about the same amount of land clearing that is currently occurring every year in the NT, mostly for pastoral development. But 100 square kilometres is still a substantial amount of country for clearing. And so we've recommended a number of mitigation actions that we believe, if these are carried out, would reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And so minimising the amount of vegetation clearing, having smallest well pads as possible, having narrowest roads, narrowest pipelines, etc. Avoiding particularly important habitats, patches of rainforest, riparian zones, particularly sensitive patches. Having a rigorous threatened species assessment process and avoiding habitats, areas that may be critically important for any threatened species. Having effective rehabilitation following operations. And then the development and implementation of offsets. And so if a development has inevitable consequences, inevitable impacts on conservation values, one way of addressing that is to compensate for the loss of those values in that place that are inevitable by funding or implementing management actions that increase conservation values by way of compensation elsewhere. And so that's something we've recommended be looked at. The next risk to biodiversity and ecosystem health that we looked at is the risk of the linear corridors through roads and pipelines to the movement of surface water and with it sediment and nutrients. And so the natural movement of water across landscapes is a very important part of top-end or NT ecosystems, and actually more important in the arid zones, but very important. And so here are our recommendations to minimise the risk of disrupting those pathways to what we consider as acceptable levels. And so our recommendations include minimising these corridor widths, burying pipelines, and minimising any erosion or changes to water flow by careful design and construction of roads and pipeline corridors. Our second key value is landscape amenity, and there were two key risks that we identified to landscape amenity. And one is the risk of unacceptable landscape transformation. We do not want to see any industrialisation of landscapes. We've all seen these horror pictures of transformed landscapes in the USA where there's tightly packed wells and it totally dominates the landscape. We don't want to see that. And so here are some of our key recommendations for avoiding that. The first one is just no-go zones. National parks, other areas of very high visitation, scenic beauty, just no-go zones. But even in where there might be gas fields, we still want to limit the landscape amenity impact of them. And so we have a couple of recommendations here. That is, the infrastructure like well pads and compressor stations, none of that be visible from public roads. And secondly, to avoid a situation of having very closely packed well pads and totally transforming the landscape, is to mandate a minimum of 2 kilometres between well pads. And finally, the final risk that we looked at is the risk of heavy vehicle traffic. We know in qualitative terms that fracking requires very, very high levels of heavy vehicle traffic. What we were unable to do is to put quantitative figures on that. We don't know how much traffic would be required, where it would come from, which of the highways it would use, and so our key recommendation is that there be a formal analysis of this. And analysis also of mitigation options, such as use of the railway rather than turning the Stuart Highway into this, and any need for substantial road upgrades. So it might be duplicating lanes, it might be increasing the frequency of overtaking lanes, or whatever would be needed to mitigate that impact. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm going to talk to you this morning about greenhouse gases, and any shale gas operation will liberate both carbon dioxide and methane, and both these are greenhouse gases, and they contribute to global warming. Effectively, what these gases are doing, they restrict the radiation of heat away from the Earth's surface. They trap some of that radiation, and it leads to warming of the Earth's surface. There are genuine concerns about the implications of greenhouse gases arising from shale gas operations in the Territory. It's also relevant to note that the panel accepts the climate change science and the implications of that in terms of temperature rise. In terms of gas, natural gas is the same as to whether it's produced by shale gas, conventional gas, coal seam gas, or tight gas. It's basically, it's all natural gas, and the predominant constituent of that is methane. In terms of global greenhouse gases, they've risen since pre-industrial times. CO2 42%, methane 154%. To the current stage that about 76% of those anthropogenic gases are carbon dioxide and 16% are methane. And most of these emissions are generated by the burning of fossil fuels, whether that be coal, oil or gas. In terms of Australia's emissions, 35% are generated by electricity, 18% from stationary energy such as heating premises, transport 17%, agriculture 13%, fugitive emissions, which we will focus on shortly, 9%, and industrial processes like smelting of aluminium, 6%. In terms of the life cycle of shale gas emissions, and by life cycle that means from the point of extraction of the gas from the ground to the point where it is actually used and combusted to generate energy, there are different emissions. There are two principal phases. One is called the upstream phase, which is extraction through to putting it in pipes, compressing it, and sending it off for use. And the downstream stage is where the gas is basically combusted for use. In the upstream stage, 5% is attributed to CO2 emissions, 17% to methane emissions, and the downstream combustion stage represents 78% of the total emissions. Those total emissions for a typical shale gas operation in the Northern Territory, if it were to go ahead, would represent about 5% of Australia's current greenhouse gas emissions, or about 0.05% of global emissions. And at that level, the panel has determined that the consequence rating is low, but the risk is medium, and that accordingly it is necessary to mitigate those levels of emissions, particularly for methane, because at the combustion stage there's not a lot that can be done, but in the upstream stage there are things that can be done to mitigate both methane principally, but something in terms of CO2 as well. In terms of fugitive emissions, based upon actual studies and results in the United States and the application of standards and technologies, it's possible to reduce the fugitive methane emissions by 23%. And noting in passing also that these life cycle emissions for natural gas are approximately half that of the greenhouse gases that would be emitted by coal burning generators, for example, in the production of electricity. Also, to put the numbers into some perspective, the emissions from a typical NT shale gas operation, if it were to proceed, as noted there, is 17%. But to put it into context, in terms of absolute terms, it's about the same as the level of methane that is emitted from the current Northern Territory cattle herd. About the same, exactly the same level. So, what are we going to do about mitigating methane emissions? The panel has determined that there should be a range of strategies that should be adopted. And they include, as previously mentioned, the introduction of new source performance standards that have been applied in the United States, that an enforceable code of practice and baseline monitoring should be introduced. And some of these recommendations are consistent with the underlying principles that the panel has adopted, namely evidence-based, transparency and openness. And another recommendation is that baseline monitoring should be the responsibility of the regulator, that it be undertaken by an independent and expert third party, and that it be funded by industry. Furthermore, that monitoring results should be published online and on a continuous real-time basis so that the public can have a look at what's going on and so that there's open and transparency in regard to the levels of methane. And not only just measuring, but being prepared to do something about it if the level of methane exceeds predetermined limits, and requiring industry to make good provisions if the limits are exceeded. In terms of abandoned wells that's already been spoken about, there is evidence that wells do leak. Not all of them after they've been taken out of production, but they do leak. And there is a percentage of them. The levels of methane that are emitted can be mitigated if abandoned wells are properly decommissioned. And that means that the wells are sealed with cement, that the top infrastructure is removed, and that the well is covered with about a metre of soil. And with those procedures, the levels of methane are normally reduced significantly. But it is recognised that these wells can go on in perpetuity, and there are issues of concern regarding the continued integrity of that sealing over, for example, 1,000 years. And in noting in this area that there is the need to have ongoing monitoring and the need to have funds available to undertake any mitigation activities should levels of methane exceed acceptable levels, and that will be spoken about subsequently. And so the assessed risks attached to methane emissions from decommissioned wells is categorised as medium. So, in conclusion then, the panel formed the view that in terms of methane emissions, there should be a suite of activities that are undertaken, and they include the introduction of new standards, the introduction of monitoring and reporting in real time, proper well decommissioning, and regulatory suite of issues that are identified in Table 9.10. And collectively, if all of those things are undertaken, then the panel determined that there's an acceptably lower risk attached to methane emissions from any shale gas operations in the Northern Territory. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and take you through some of the issues that we took into consideration when we looked at the potential impacts of the development of the shale gas industry in the Northern Territory on public health. It's a summary of what's in the chapter. There's a lot more detail there. But I think that we initially felt that there was a need to consider these impacts in two main areas. Firstly, to look at the chemicals that are associated with these processes, and I'm thinking here about the chemicals that are actually used in the fracking fluids, but perhaps more importantly, as we've heard from other presentations, the chemicals that may come up from the shale rock in the flowback water, because these tend to be somewhat more toxic and therefore probably deserve somewhat more attention. The second thing we needed to look at was the potential impact of the development of the industry on what we call well-being and amenity, and the way that may change people's health. I'll cover these separately in the last slide of my part of the presentation. Coming back to the chemicals issue, we fairly quickly came to the realisation that the risk associated with chemicals that are used in this process will depend very much upon where the development occurs, and in particular where that development occurs in relation to things like water resources and where people may be exposed, where people live. And so therefore the first thing we decided was that the importance of having what we call site-specific human health risk assessments to be carried out for any new development of these gas areas. And this is not really a new proposal. That sort of activity, a health risk assessment, is a normal part of any environmental impact statement or requirement for a new development. And there's a lot of information, guidance on how to do these sorts of risk assessments. Nationally, the nHealth Council, which is the council of officials from state and territory and Commonwealth agencies responsible for environmental health, they've published guidance on how to do health risk assessment. But also more importantly, just before we finalised the draft final report, we were able to see the guidance that was the National Chemicals Risk Assessment guidance that was published by the Department of Environment and Energy of the Commonwealth, which was specifically related to risk assessment of chemicals associated with coal seam gas development. Now, while there are differences between coal seam gas and shale gas, there are enough commonalities in terms of chemical risks that that's very useful and important guidance. And as has been pointed out by previous speakers, a very important piece of information that's needed to do these sorts of risk assessments is what are the chemicals that are used in hydraulic fracturing fluids, and particularly what are the chemicals that come back up in the flowback water. And so our recommendations do include require for mandatory reporting on those chemical compositions of those waters. If you look to see how a risk assessment is done for chemicals, there are three main elements to this. The first is to identify those chemicals which are most likely to contribute to adverse health effects, whether they be in the fracking fluids, whether they be in the flowback water, whether they be in dust or vapours that come off the sites where these things are stored. Certainly we have some information about the toxicity of some of these chemicals. Some of them are relatively low in toxicity, others are somewhat higher. And in particular, given some of the information that we saw from our consultations in southeast Queensland and the published literature, we realised that we also needed to take into consideration the chemicals that are associated with the gas flaring processes. Because these seem to be associated with some of the adverse health effects that have been reported around these gas fields. The second element of a risk assessment is to work out how people may be exposed. What are the pathways from the site of emission to where people might be exposed, and how much of that chemical will move down those pathways, and what are the levels of exposure that would occur. And so it's important to have that information in order to conduct the risk assessment. And then finally, once you have that information, you can do a comparison of those predicted levels of exposure with what are health-based guidance values, in other words, levels of exposure which are unlikely to result in adverse health effects. Even the most toxic chemicals will have a level of exposure which is unlikely to produce an adverse health effect, and obviously the less toxic the chemical, the higher that level may be. As has been pointed out previously, when we look to assess the risks associated with the water contamination issue, the panel came to the conclusion that these risks are likely to be low where there are adequate controls over well integrity and fluid and chemical storage and waste disposal. And we did have access to some risk assessments that have been done in the Australian context. Some of these are reviewed in the chapter. We did consider that the information in these risk assessments was somewhat limited because in many cases they did not consider off-site exposures because they concluded that these pathways were likely to be incomplete. The National Chemicals Risk Assessment guidance suggests that these pathways should be considered, and that's part of what we're also saying as well. And the other thing that we realised in looking at the literature, particularly the literature that comes from the United States and from southeast Queensland, where there have been reports of public health impacts of this industry, it's the thing that became quite apparent is it's the airborne pathway which may become the more important one for producing adverse health effects, whether these be gases, vapours or dusts. And in this instance, it's the distance from the emission site to where people are exposed that becomes the most important factor. As you'll appreciate, these materials are likely to be diluted as they move away from the site of emission, and so distance from the site is turned out to be a very critical factor in whether or not there would be adverse health effects. And this led us to recommend an appropriate setback distance from any of the gas wells or processing facilities to where people may live in order to minimise that risk. And the appropriate setback distance we've selected is 1.6 kilometres or about a mile, which is based upon primarily the US data. Finally, we did make an attempt to assess some of the impacts on wellbeing and amenity. The consultations we had in southeast Queensland, for example, as was related earlier, talked a lot about some of the stress associated with negotiating land access and impacts on property values. And so these have been addressed in some of the recommendations that have been put as to how this industry should be better regulated. We also noted that increases in road traffic are likely to have a consequent effect on road trauma. And so, again, that's something that needs to be monitored and measured. There could well be effects on the health of Aboriginal communities through impacts on their culture, and Dr. Ritchie will talk more about how that was addressed in our assessments in the next session. The point that I'm trying to probably make here is that the magnitude and health impacts of these risks are likely to be dependent upon the scale of the development and, more importantly, the phase of the development. Because some of these activities are likely to be more intense, for example, during the exploration and early development stage, and during the production phase there'll be probably somewhat less impact. And so that's an important factor to be taken into consideration. And then finally, as has been mentioned by other speakers this morning, it's really important to have some baseline information available on what are the current public health status in communities where these gas fields are likely to be developed, in order to assess whether there has been any sort of change in public health as a result of the development of this industry. And so inclusion of public health data in the strategic, regional and baseline assessments has been an important recommendation as well. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. There's a couple of things about this next section of the presentation. There's two bits, they're related. You've all understand that one of the things that the inquiry has had to deal with is the effects of this proposed industry, should the moratorium be lifted, on the communities that live in the region where it's most likely to be undertaken, and that is the Beetaloo Basin. I'll deal with the more general social impacts in a minute, but the most obvious thing, I think, to anybody that knows the territory is that this region is remote, and that the majority of Territorians living there are Aboriginal people, and that either under the Land Rights Act or under their native title rights, which both reflect more ancient traditional forms of title, they actually have a proprietary interest in the land. You don't always think of this, but the way in which native title has been enshrined in European law accords with one of the fundamental aspects of native title, and that is that it relies on the transmission of the traditions linking people with country for that title to be maintained. There is no equivalent in the either under the Land Rights Act or the Native Title Act for the Aboriginal tradition or owners of that land to just will their land to their children and their grandchildren. The only way that that ownership right is transmitted is through the transmission of traditions relating to that land. That makes the communities, the Aboriginal communities in this region, particularly vulnerable to anything that is going to disrupt that process, the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and meaning about the land. And that's why it's the subject of a separate chapter. These dot points go through summarise what I've just been saying, which is really that Aboriginal people are the majority of the population living on that land where shale gas is located. They must be able to maintain their culture and ownership for their ownership rights to continue. If the landscape suffers, so will the Aboriginal people and communities there. That in exercising decisions about country, that the traditional owners have to have good information about not just what's proposed today or tomorrow, but in the longer term. And this industry, one of the real aspects of this industry, that it tends to be incremental, that it's not less like an open cut mine or some of the kind of extractive industries we're used to, where things happen pretty quickly. This is an industry that is incremental and can affect very large areas over time. There is got to be a plan if there is the moratorium is lifted for how all that's to be achieved. But one thing that is absolutely certain, that the Aboriginal communities living there have to be completely involved and able to exercise their rights. And I'll come to what their rights are now. Our recommendations on this are that go to really the areas of land, which are the majority of the land in this area, which is covered by native title. There are some areas to the north in the Beetaloo Basin that are held under communal freehold under the Land Rights Act. Under that title, Aboriginal traditional owners have a right of veto, and they can exercise that even if the moratorium is lifted. So they can, under their rights, under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, say no to a proposal to hydraulically frack under their land, so long as they exercise it at the exploration phase. The majority of traditional owners in that area hold their land under native title, and that there is no veto under native title. One of the bundle of native title rights, though, is the right to protect culturally significant places. And what we're recommending is that those laws protecting culturally significant places, which is under the Northern Territory Aboriginal Sacred Sites Act, be strengthened. One of the things we say should be strengthened is to clarify whether those laws apply to site features that lie underground as well as on the surface. It's been submitted to us that they do, but the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, who has carriage of that legislation, has asked us and submitted to us that that should be clarified. We're also saying that any gas company be required to obtain approvals under the Sacred Sites legislation, which involves, and by necessity, then having to actually consult with people and finding out where culturally significant places are before even the exploration licence is given. At the moment, that provision in the legislation is not mandatory. We'll go to some very specific and perhaps again obvious recommendations that interpreters must be used for all consultations, that a comprehensive assessment of the cultural impact of the industry be undertaken before the production licences are granted, if the moratorium is lifted, and that governments, the government and governments at all levels, both local government and the territory government, collaborate with lands councils to ensure that reliable and accurate information is provided to all Aboriginal communities affected, so they can exercise their rights in a way that is informed and able to engage with some of the more complex issues that they will have to confront. These points go to that, but the last point there is that governments, gas companies and lands councils be required to actually make publicly available agreements that are made for this applying to this industry, because again it's been submitted to us by communities that we visited that they find it almost impossible to find information about what's actually happened, who's agreed to what, and on what basis those agreements were made. Now, moving on to social impacts, we're all pretty familiar with environmental impact assessments. Social impact assessments is a kind of an industry way of trying to understand what the effects of a particular proposal are on the community where the proposal is likely to take place, and to minimise the harmful effects and to maximise the benefits. One of the key things in that is the ability of the necessity for the proponents of the development, in this case the gas industry, to actually become a valued member of that community, and that's termed a social licence. Our consultations across the area over the last 12 months have indicated that the gas industry is not regarded as part of the community and is not welcome in the community. We engaged an international company who does social impact assessments to give us an overview of what a framework for a social impact assessment in the Beetaloo Basin, again because that's the most likely area to be developed, so that we can, basically, in our recommendations, say to government, this is what is needed before that this, if you lift the moratorium, this industry moves to a production phase. One of the assumptions at the start of the work that they did was that the gas industry has no social licence in the Northern Territory. The Coffee Pub have produced three different reports, all dealing with different aspects of this work, which are on our website. But just to summarise and to show you what I mean about the level of anxiety that this industry is generating out in the communities where it's likely to take place. Really, the bars going over to your left, the fawny pink ones, are all indicate areas of anxiety and concern. The blue ones on the other side are areas where people think that there might be some benefits. And as you can see, there's just an overwhelming level of concern on pretty well all the indicators. Just going through why a social impact assessment is important, with more or less these dot points go with what I've already said. The idea is that to actually understand how an industry will affect the local community is you've got to actually understand how the local community works and the relative levels of disadvantage and advantage in that community. And again, the purpose is to work out what are the likely effects, minimise the bad and maximise the good. The only way it's found that can happen is with a long-term strategic and collaborative approach with the communities themselves. And that's at the heart of our recommendations around this. These are just a list of the likely communities, and as you can see, they're all in the communities surrounding that Beetaloo Basin, running from Katherine in the north, Tennant Creek in the south, across to Borroloola, up to Nooka and back to Daly Waters and Elliot. There's a number of you can list potential threats on pages, but one of the things we found not surprising but particularly significant is the very high degree of distrust between the community and the industry, and more significantly the distrust between the community and government to control the industry. So the recommendations that we'll come up with is that you've heard about the strategic regional baseline assessments for the environment and some of the other issues associated with the industry. We are recommending that takes place to gain an understanding of the effect of this industry on communities and to inform government the whole approval process before the industry moves to a production phase, and more to the point, before approvals are given for the industry to move to a production phase. Okay, thank you.
Economic impacts. As you may well be aware, we don't have an economist on the panel, so we commissioned Assel Allen, who are a large consulting company, to have a look to see through modelling whether or not there would be any economic benefits or risks to the territory if the government lifts the moratorium. And it used its considerable expertise and experience with the petroleum industry, which was appropriate, to do that. And of course, there is no industry here. There is no development proposal here. So we asked them really to do quite a difficult task, which was, well, model something that doesn't yet exist and provide us with an estimate of those benefits or of those risks. So naturally, there had to be a fair amount of assumptions that went into the model that it constructed. And of course, the more assumptions you have, the higher the degree of uncertainty, and that was reflected in a probability matrix that is in their report. We did not ask Assel Allen to look at or comment upon the commercial viability of this industry if it comes to the territory. We didn't ask them to do that, and they didn't do that. So whatever reports you've read to that effect in the media are just wrong. So as I said, there's a high degree of uncertainty because the scope of this industry is not known. They did work from figures that the industry gave, and I think Dr. Smith has referred to those here today in terms of the number of wells and so on, and where the industry might take place. They did have the data from the one well drilled at by Origin at Amungi, and that seems to indicate that there is commercial quantities of gas available. But that's one well. And we also asked them, I should say, just going back, we also asked them to be conservative as well. We asked them to be very conservative. There have been other economic reports that have been undertaken on this very issue. The Deloitte report is one of those reports. And again, each report will come up with different conclusions depending on the assumptions, depending on how the model is constructed. We asked ASL-Allen to look to be very conservative in its assumptions, and also to look not just at the supply side, which is what happened with the Deloitte report, but also the demand. You can have all the gas in the world, but if nobody actually wants it, then it's not going to do much to increase the revenue base or economy, grow the economy of a jurisdiction. So ASL modeled how the economy would look under 5 different scenarios. Baseline, what happens if the ban stays? Calm, what if there's exploration work only? So there's a few wells and holes that are drilled, but for whatever reason, in fact, the Origin Amungi well was anomalous, and there isn't the amount of gas there that perhaps was predicted. Or alternatively, it costs too much to get out of the ground. Or alternatively still, it's just not economically viable to get it to market. Prices crashed, or the price of renewables has come down, whatever that may be. So that's exploration only, and then based on that, the gas companies go home. Shale Breeze, small-scale development, 103 wells. Shale Wind, medium development, 167 wells. And then Shale Gale, large development of 670 wells. Now, for the keen observer, you will note that this is approximately half of the industry's estimate to date of the number of wells, which, as Dr. Smith said, is in the order of about 1,000 to 1,200 wells. So again, this emphasizes how conservative ASL-Allen were in their estimates. And again, this sort of indicates, I think, the differences and highlights differences between Deloitte and ASL. I won't dwell on this, but effectively, again, it reflects the fact that Deloitte really only looked at the supply side, how much gas is there, as opposed to who wants it. Real income. Well, that's really effectively the amount of money that residents have in their pocket, you have in your pocket at the end of the day to pay rent, buy groceries, fuel, and so on. So again, ASL modeled whether or not there would be any increases in the real income of Territorians over a 25-year period, which again is probably a fairly, an overly, perhaps, or not overly, but a conservative time frame. We know that the well lives tend to be sort of 20 to possibly 40 years, depending on how productive they are. But they chose 25 years. Permanent moratorium, no additional income comes in. Exploration, 35 million, small development, 937, medium 2.8 billion, and large 5.8 billion. And remember, this is only over 25 years and over in relation to half of the number of wells that industry is estimating if a large-scale development takes place. Jobs. Will this create any jobs? Again, ASL modeled the 5 scenarios. And they modeled them over 25 years, but over 25 job years. So in any 1 year, times 25, how many jobs in that 1 year will be created? Permanent ban, obviously, no new jobs. Exploration, 5. Small, 82. Medium, 252 jobs. Large, 524 jobs, averaged out over 25 years per year. And that is indirect and direct jobs as well. So it could certainly be argued that this isn't going to create a jobs bonanza. based, as I said, on the assumptions and the inputs that ASL-ALLEN have adopted. Population growth. There's currently a negative net population growth in the Northern Territory, which means more people are leaving the territory permanently than are coming to the territory permanently. And that's just not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the economy, the tax base, the social structure. You want to grow your jurisdiction. Again, they modelled how many people would come to the Northern Territory as a result of this industry over 25, at any time over 25 years. Permanent ban, obviously no one. Expiration 10, small 195, medium 595, and large a little over 1,200. So what are some of the key recommendations? We asked ASL-ALLEN to have a look at some of the policies in existence and in other jurisdictions and some of the learnings and come up with some fundamental recommendations. One of them was that the government has to ensure that the areas that are impacted, the regions impacted by this development, if the government lifts a moratorium, actually get some of the benefits by way of improved infrastructure, schools, hospitals, even telecommunications, whatever that may be. West Australia has enacted a Royalties for Regions program. There have been some problems associated with that, but those programs certainly do exist. And certainly that's the feedback we have gotten from communities that we've spoken to, which is, well, look, if we're going to have to wear the burden of this industry, then we would also like some of the benefits as well. We don't want it just going back to Darwin or Canberra. The other key recommendation was early planning. You have to make sure before the industry starts that that planning is in place, not just social impact planning, as Dr. Ritchie talked about, but also the economic planning so that local communities can engage with and take the benefit, maximize the benefits of this industry coming. They can upskill by way of trainings, they can put programs in place, they can do their homework in terms of housing and so on. Again, when we went to Queensland and spoke to mayors past and present and people from the community there, it was very apparent that that hadn't occurred, and so that those local communities and businesses weren't able to maximize the benefits, and in some cases suffered greatly as a consequence. And once it comes, it's you're playing catch up. And third, I suppose those first two. Third is that again you have to be very careful and make sure that there are no adverse impacts on other industries which are profitable in the Northern Territory that do contribute towards the economy and the community, such as tourism, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, fishing, recreational fishing, for example, commercial fishing, and so on. So this has to be, again, and this goes back to sort of the planning as well. You've got to make sure that your planning is in place beforehand. All right. Regulatory reform, last chapter. We've all seen this map. It's a very ugly map. It indicates that I think 85% of the territory is currently subject to an exploration permit. Some of them are in the process of becoming defunct, I should say. At the moment, what happens is the Minister for Resources decides which land to release. It may take into account land release policy, but the minister's not required to. Then there's a notice that's published inviting applications in relation to the land, and companies apply, and on one view, looking at this map, the exploration permit is given. And the community, you have no ability to have direct input into that decision-making process. And we all think that's a problem. So really, the take-home message, and I'm sure this is probably a take-home message that it's a recurrent theme across all the chapters, is the need to improve transparency, accountability through monitoring, through compliance, and so on. And that's certainly the case when it comes to making land available for onshore shale gas exploration and the decisions relating to that land, whether it's exploration permits, environmental management plans, or indeed production licenses. The panel's very strong view is that the community has to be given an opportunity to comment on land release and on other decisions relating to onshore shale gas exploration and the impact that this might have on land. And we know there's a long history of learning that says that where the public is given the opportunity to comment, and the minister must take that into account. Mandatory relevant legal consideration is the legal terminology. Then while that may not necessarily, the minister's decision may not necessarily accord with what the community wants, nevertheless, there is improved decision-making processes. There are improved decision-making processes. So we think that the minister has to be made to consider. It has to be a mandatory relevant consideration whether any onshore shale gas industry can coexist with current and future land uses. We also very strongly believe that there is certain land that must be no-go zones, never, never, never available for exploration, for fracking, for development. Areas of high tourism value, residential areas, national parks, conservation reserves, areas of high ecological significance, areas of cultural significance, obviously including sacred sites, but also areas that are important to a sense of place for community, and areas of agricultural value as well. We had a very good presentation from the NT Farmers Federation here in Darwin, and they said, look, you can very easily map out the current areas that are in use for agricultural production and the future areas as well that have been identified. These have all been spatially mapped already. They are readily identifiable, and again, you can draw a circle around those and make those a no-go zone. Improved decision-making. I've already referenced this. As I said, I think the decision-making here has to become more transparent and accountable. Time and time again in community consultations, we have heard that the criticism has been that that the system is opaque. It's not accountable. People don't know what's going on. People don't know how, even how the decisions are made. And obviously, that is not good for the community, and it's not good for decision-making processes. So, as I said, I think it can be strengthened at every step of the way. Some ways that can be done, which are reflected in our recommendations, are, a requirement. It has to be a mandatory relevant consideration that the principles of ESD, including intergenerational equity and precautionary principle, are considered and applied in the decision-making process. There has to be a requirement that a gas company is a fit and proper person to hold either an exploration permit or a license or some other type of approval. So there has to be an examination, an interrogation of the history of environmental compliance, including financial capability of the company, both domestically and overseas, both that company and related entities and companies as well. And again, these are nothing particularly new. This information is readily available. So that what you don't want is some $2 clean skin shelf company setting up, when in fact its parent company overseas, for example, has got a terrible environmental history. Mandatory publication of reasons for decisions. Again, there has to be greater transparency. You need to be able to know why, to see what decisions have been made first, and second, why they have been made. Reasons need to be provided so that you can make sure that appropriate considerations have, and mandatory relevant considerations and other factors have been taken into account. So again, that will provide, obviously, opportunities for comment, and importantly, and the next point is important, it will provide the ability for communities, individuals, to challenge decisions. We say this opportunity should be allowed. There should be much greater access to justice. Challenge decisions in a relevant court or tribunal. In my jurisdiction, in the Land and Environment Court of New South Wales, we have open standing for most of the legislation that governs our jurisdiction. That means that anybody here can commence an action challenging, say, the lawfulness of a minister's decision to grant an exploration permit or to improve an environmental management plan. And so it can either be individuals or community groups. Now, my court's not flooded with these types of claims. As we all know, legal actions are costly, both financial and emotional as well. That does act as a barrier. But individuals can and do bring these suits, and groups, particularly community groups, environmental groups, can and do bring these suits in my court. And they are, from time to time, successful in overturning government decisions. And if the government knows that its decisions will be subject to scrutiny and can be challenged in courts by anyone, then again, there's a long line of learning and literature that strongly suggests that the governments make better decisions. Again, I think that's a matter of somewhat of common sense. And also, we strongly believe that that the regulations have to be reformulated to accommodate for area-based, regional-based, play-based, however you want to describe it, regulation and oversight. So that you're not just looking at, and again, going back to that slide that Dr. Smith showed of the Origin, Santos, and Pangaea proposed developments. There's not just assessment of, oh, this development over here, in isolation to that development over there, in isolation to that development over there. That you're looking at, for example, the whole of the Beetaloo subbasin, the whole of that region, to assess what the whole of the industry and all of the proposals will have on water, landscape degradation, clearing, and so on, social impacts as well. I think that's very important. Again, this happens in other jurisdictions, in Canada. It happens to a much more limited extent in Queensland. In relation to groundwater, they have an Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment, OGIA it's called, which that's what it does. It basically does area-based, regional-based assessments of groundwater use by the gas industry, and I think they're about to include the mining industry in that as well, for good reason. Objective-based regulation and prescriptive-based prescriptive regulation and codes of conduct and so on. It's always good to have a mix of both objective-based regulation and prescriptive regulation. Objective-based regulation is really sort of value-driven regulation. Don't harm the environment would be a very highly general value-based sort of regulation or example of regulation. Now that can be useful because it does allow gas companies the flexibility to adopt emerging world-leading practice and technologies, and you want that. You want to encourage that. You don't want just a tick-a-box exercise. Oh yeah, I've complied with these minimum statutory requirements and my job is done, even though the world may have moved on. That's not what you want. But the panel does feel very strongly that with respect to certain aspects of this industry, for example, Dr. Jones talking about well integrity, that there ought to be prescriptive minimum enforceable requirements that gas companies must comply with. The recommendation for Category 9 wells or equivalent to be constructed is an example of prescriptive regulation. At the moment, a lot of the regulations and rules governing how wells are drilled and so on are contained in the Schedule of Onshore Exploration and Production Requirements, and it's not an enforceable document. It's we're told, largely complied with, but again, I'm not sure for a industry that wants to engender trust, wants to build a social license to operate, that's satisfactory. And that's actually recognised by the industry. The gas companies have said, yeah, we agree that the schedule should be repealed and replaced with something enforceable. So we strongly make that recommendation. Improved financial assurances. What do I mean by that? We're talking here about sort of bonds, rehabilitation bonds, levies for orphan wells, and so on. At the moment, the present system of bonds and securities for remediation and rehabilitation is pretty. It's inadequate. We don't know how those amounts are calculated. We don't know why the government's sort of asked for the contributions it has. They do ask for them. These assurances do exist, but it's hard to find out the underlying basis for them. And we all know from legacy mines around the Northern Territory and Queensland and Victoria and New South Wales, and indeed that's why there's a Senate inquiry into this very issue as I speak, that they can be approved, that too often something goes wrong or the company leaves and decades later environmental problems emerge and there's no one there to remediate and pay for that remediation other than you, the taxpayer. So they can be approved, and we've made some recommendations around those, particularly in terms of, again, not having to reinvent the wheel, but looking at what other jurisdictions do in terms of leading practice financial assurance regimes. So those bonds need to accurately reflect the cost of rehabilitation now and way into the future. And we've also recommended a non-refundable orphan well levy, which I think Dr. Beck touched upon this, to ensure that funds are available. So after the company has decommissioned the well, so it's been plugged, and they leave the land, and the current system is the liability leaves with them once they've decommissioned and they've left. You've got these wells that are there in perpetuity. It's the same with oil wells. So who takes care of those wells? Who monitors those wells? Who makes sure that they still have integrity? Oh, again, you ask for the companies to put into a levy, and that levy then is again immunized. It's separate, and that's used exclusively for the purpose of orphan wells. Again, this is nothing new. This happens in other jurisdictions, certainly overseas. Compliance and enforcement. The panel's of the view that the current laws with respect to sanctions, so if a gas company does the wrong thing, are too weak and can be strengthened in line with what's happening in other jurisdictions in Australia and overseas. We have to make sure that the sanctions don't simply become the cost of doing business in the Northern Territory. That cannot be allowed to occur. So fines have to be increased. The fines, in our view, are too low. There has to be an other range of sanctions that are contemplated, such as jail of company directors. I'm permitted to do that in my jurisdiction. I've never personally done that, but certainly people have been sent to jail for environmental offences in New South Wales. Revocation of permits, licences. You do the wrong thing, it's taken away. That's a very powerful, given the amount of money that tends to be spent, sanction, and a very powerful incentivization to make sure you do comply with the laws and with your conditions of approvals. Again, I think that system has to be more transparent, and where there is non-compliance, the public is afforded the opportunity of doing something about it if they feel the government isn't doing something about it. Of course, in order to do that, you need to know what the gas companies can and can't do. So those approvals, those licenses, permits, that should all be publicly available information up there for all the world to see. Again, this is not radical, it's not new. And that will allow you then, if you think that the gas company is doing the wrong thing, and you want to take a sort of effectively a citizen suit, it's called a civil enforcement suit, a civil enforcement action, you can do that. Again, in the jurisdiction that I come from, Land Environment Court, these are permitted. They do not clog up the courts, but it allows you as Jane or Joe citizen to say, well, I think this company is about to breach or is in breach of their license conditions. I'm going to take the matter to court, ask for an injunction to make sure that that stops, and then ask for orders with respect to rehabilitation and remediation. These types of actions do occur in New South Wales. As I said, there are barriers to why there are no floodgates arguments, but that are applicable. They do occur, and they have been brought, successfully. And there should be also, I think, a reversal of the onus of proof, so that it provided a certain minimum threshold, evidential sort of threshold is met, if it can be shown that, look, the land has been degraded, for example, near a well, and it was, baseline studies have shown that it was, that area was perfectly fine before, or the water was perfectly fine before, then the onus of proof reverses, and it then becomes up to the gas company to prove that they didn't cause that environmental harm or damage. Again, it's a powerful incentive to do the right thing, and it also ensures that that baseline data is obtained properly, so you get a before and after comparison. Again, these are not brand new inventions. I just want to talk briefly about what we've recommended in relation to pastoral land, and then I'll come back to sort of broader reform of the regulator. It was argued very strongly and cogently that by many pastoralists, including the NTCA, that there should be a right of veto, and certainly the panel recognises the enduring connection that many pastoralists have with the land. In some cases, those leases are in perpetuity, or at least they're handed down from generation to generation. There's no denying that. But ultimately, we have not recommended a veto. We have done so for many reasons. They're set out in the report, primarily because, regrettably for all of us, we don't own what is beneath the surface of the land. The Crown, which is effectively all of you, own what is beneath the surface of the land. And to impose a right of veto would have radically transformed that right on this would have been the only jurisdiction in Australia where it would have been afforded. Interestingly, it wasn't universally reflected in the submission. So there were pastoralists who said, no, we don't think that there should be a right of veto, but there should be greater protections. And we agree with that. We certainly agree with that. So what we've recommended is there has to be a mandatory statutory land access agreement that is negotiated and signed before any activity whatsoever can take place on pastoral land. That's to shift the balance, the power imbalance, which I think is a recognised power imbalance, and that was certainly what we were told when we went to Queensland and spoke to pastoralists and farmers up there, to shift that power balance back towards the pastoralists. These agreements are certainly negotiated and signed currently in the Northern Territory, but they're not mandatory. They're not mandatory, and I think that difference is important. And we would argue that breach of the land access agreement should be a breach of the approval to carry out the activity on that land. We also think that there should be certain, in the contract, and it is a contract, the agreement, there should be certain minimum protections which cannot be negotiated out of. So you start from those minimum protections and you go up, not down. Things like making sure that there are proper indemnities in place, make good provisions, the payment of reasonable legal costs, the payment of reasonable costs to engage experts to advise you, hydrologists, seismologists, and so on. Again, this is done in other jurisdictions. There's no reason why it can't be done here. Confidentiality clauses is something that has come up regularly. A number of pastoralists have said, look, there's a lot of pressure put on us to agree to confidentiality clauses. We don't like that. We want to be able to go and speak to our neighbour about, the agreement that we negotiated. We agree. So again, it's a recommendation that there be no confidentiality clause unless mutually agreed to by the parties. There may be good reason. There may be some people who go, no, I'm quite happy to have my agreement secret. I personally wouldn't want necessarily to share the contract for sale of my house, for example, with all of you. So there are some good reasons, but again, it has to be mutually agreed by the parties. We also, of course, have said that the government should implement a mandatory minimum compensation scheme, but let me emphasise the word minimum, and again, the idea is that you can negotiate up, but at least there's a transparent sort of mechanism as at the minimum for how that compensation might be calculated. Let's go back to reform of the regulator. We've been told time and time again, in no community meeting has this not come up, that people do not trust the regulator in the Northern Territory to do the right thing. They don't have the resourcing, the capacity, they don't have the independence, and they don't have the, even in some cases, the willingness to carry out effective monitoring, compliance, enforcement, and so on. There's a couple of large recommendations that we've made to address that. One is the implementation of a full cost recovery system so that you ensure that effectively the gas industry pays for the reforms that we have suggested. And really, throughout all of the discussions with the chapters, all of those are effectively, all of the recommendations will require some type of reform, some type of regulatory reform. And it's not the taxpayers that should have to pay for that. It's the gas company. If they want this resource, the panel's very strong view is that they should pay for it, and they should pay for the infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure, to allow it to safely occur. Again, this is nothing new. South Australia has a full fee recovery system. In fact, it recovers so much by way of money, it actually gives it back to the government after it has allocated what it needs. There has to be a clear separation between the agency that's responsible for promoting the industry and the agency that is responsible for compliance and enforcement. At the moment, that's not the case. So you've got, on the one, you've got the same department saying, come to the Northern Territory and invest your dollars here, grow our economy. It's the same department that then has to turn around to those gas companies, those same gas companies, say, oh, you've done the wrong thing and now we're going to hit you over the head with sanctions. You can see the immediate tension. It's not healthy. And in our view, again, to build trust in the community, in the regulatory system, that has to be separate. There are two options, I think, or two ways of doing this. One must be done. We recommend it now, before anything takes place. And this is actually getting towards consistent with what's currently being mooted or proposed by the NT government. So it's an easy fix. That's the first option, and option two is slightly more dramatic. So let me just go to a diagram of option one. So with option one, as I said, we separate out promotion, that is the granting of the exploration permits. That stays with the Minister for Resources, but all other environmental approvals, all other environmental decisions, that stays with that goes to a separate department and a separate minister, the Minister for Environment, who has to sign off on that. We would recommend that the Minister for Environment is advised by an independent advisory body, truly independent advisory body, that makes recommendations to the Minister and also consults with other departments. Those consultations and those recommendations, again, must be made public so that you know if the Minister is just going to make a decision that's contrary to those recommendations. So all the environmental approvals would be hived off and kept separate. Water, we think, should probably stay where it is, under the controller of Water Resources. Again, having said that, though, that picks up the reforms that we've suggested in Chapter 7, that the petroleum industry must be subject to the Water Act. There must be licensed, the gas industry must be licensed and must pay for the water. But by having water approval separate, that allows, again, that sort of area-based, more holistic look at water allocation, water use, and allows decisions to be made on that basis. Option two is to establish a separate and independent regulator, completely separate and independent regulator called the Unconventional Shale Gas Regulator. It's a name we just made up. It would report to the Minister for the Environment, and again, I think that's appropriate in a Westminster system, where ultimately, if you don't like the decisions that the Minister for the Environment has made, you can vote that person out. But it would be not staffed by departmental mandarins and politicians. It would be staffed by, hopefully, scientists who advise the Minister accordingly. It would be set up under separate legislation. It would have to consult, obviously, with other departments. Those consultations, those recommendations, again, must be made public. Again, we think that the current regime with respect to water approvals is fine. Again, that will allow for, provided the other recommendations that we have made are followed through, it allows for that area-based or more holistic assessment of water. This is more radical. This will require wholesale regulatory reform. It will cost money. It will take time. So that's why we are recommending option one now, immediately, prior to any exploration, and then the government consider option two. Finally, I just want to make one final comment about the 120 recommendations that we've made. We've made those recommendations, and they're draft recommendations, and they will change subject to the feedback that we are getting during our community consultations. That's a package. Our very strong view is that the government ought not cherry pick out certain recommendations and ignore others. Our risk assessments have been made based on the package. So it's very important that we emphasize that. That's the end of the formal presentation. As I said, we will now allow an hour for discussion.